The following program is a UW-TV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. We live in a time of heightened sensitivity to culture, particularly to those qualities that make each culture different and unique. But Martin Daly and Margo Wilson search for what is universal in the human condition, the behaviors and rituals of men, women, and children that are, as they once put it, culturally diverse in detail, but monotonously alike in the abstract. Husband and wife, Daly and Wilson, are psychologists and evolutionary biologists who teach at McMaster University in Ontario, Canada. They visited the University of Washington as 1997 Walker Ames lecturers. And welcome to Seattle and to the University of Washington.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
I wanted to begin by talking about your field, explaining it a little bit for people, because it seemed to boil it down to the simplest way of looking at it. It's a way of understanding human nature really by being able to see the forest for the trees.
That's nice. Yeah, I mean, we're psychologists by training. We've done our degrees in psychology, and in some ways we're doing ordinary psychological science. I mean, psychologists are not clinicians, but academic psychologists, psychological scientists are interested in how people process information, people and other animals, in perception and motivation and emotions and things like that. And really, the buzz phrase evolutionary psychology that's become popular recently, I think all it refers to is doing psychological science in sort of the shadow of evolutionary biology, bearing in mind that all the sort of complex information processing and motivational and emotional paraphernalia that we've got between our ears evolved, and people know something about the evolutionary process. And if you try and bear in mind what evolutionary biologists think they know about the evolutionary process, does this help you do your psychology in any way?
So one of the big parts of your work, a big portion of it, has to do with homicide. Why is that when you're looking at these universal behaviors, universal conditions, why is that such a fruitful area for inquiry?
Well, when we first started studying the human animal, if you like, because we have studied other species and we still do, we were interested in certain aspects of conflict, interpersonal conflict. We had theories about it derived from thinking selectionally about the human condition and human mind and what people are likely to care passionately about and what they're likely to have differences of opinion about and conflicts of interest about. And one area we were particularly interested in was male-female conflict, especially marital conflict. And we thought we would like to find good data on marital conflict, what it was all about. We didn't want to just ask people a standard psychological thing about fill out a questionnaire or something like that.
It's a subject to some error.
It is subject to some error. And so we thought, where in the real world can you get this kind of information about conflict? And we thought about using the courts, but then we thought, well, who's using the courts? We might get some really biased samples. They're either very wealthy people or very poor people, and there's special biases that we might not know what they all are. And we thought of using shelters for women. This was several years ago when battered shelters were just starting up, and we thought, well, we could talk to the women there. But then we thought we only get the woman's point of view. And then again, at that time, perhaps it's only poor women that were using the shelters. So then we hit upon this idea of homicide archives. We'd never studied homicide ever before ourselves, and we knew nothing about it. I don't think we'd ever read a criminology book. We weren't particularly enamored with detective stories or anything like that. And but we thought, well, at least in homicides, they're all investigated. It's a serious crime everywhere. The record keeping would be good, and that we'd have at least minimal information on this conflict, because surely when somebody kills somebody, they care passionately enough to do this act. Everybody, thinks homicide, even the perpetrators. I think it's a very dire action. And so we didn't know whether it would work. And since we live in Hamilton, which is only about a 3.5-hour drive from Detroit, which was known as the murder capital of America at one time anyway, we contacted the chief of police to see if we could use their archives, and he put us in touch at that time with the second in command, who actually turned out to have a PhD in sociology. And he was very receptive to our coming there and looking at the records and creating an archive of data to test some of our ideas.
Now, in the introduction, I talked about the interest you have in the universality of behavior. Are you confident that murder exists in every culture?
I'd be real surprised.
I don't know of an exception, but it's not really the universality of homicide per se that interests us. I mean, certainly it's extremely rare in a lot of places, and for that matter, it's believe it or not, it's rare in the modern Western world and rare in even the United States compared to a lot of settings and perhaps ancestral chronic circumstances. But we're just trying to use it as a window on conflicts, and where the universalities seem to arise is in certain kinds of patterned risk. Margo was talking about, we were originally interested primarily in marital conflict, and then once we got into the archives, we thought, gosh, this is a wonderfully revealing source of information about interpersonal conflicts generally. But the rates at which men kill their wives might vary, I don't know, something on the order of tenfold, perhaps very much higher than that between modern nation states. Huge differences in the gross rates. And yet, some of the demographic risk patterns, the substantive issues, the factors that elevate the likelihood of this happening within a given society seem to be very similar from place to place. And where they're different, or where there's aspects that are different, then our general strategy, and I think actually it's the strategy of psychologists in general, not just evolutionary psychologists, is to try and sort of back up to a level of abstraction where it's the same animal. Where you say, well, what is it about the ecological circumstance, the cultural context, the social cost-benefit structure, deterrence or incentives that makes a human being who is at some level of abstraction the same animal respond differently here than here? And it's trying to find that level of abstraction at which we're all the same animal that I think is most of what psychologists are up to, regardless of whether they're thinking evolutionarily or not.
Margo, talk a bit about the patterns that you found, the patterns that emerge that give it that universality.
Well, for example, in the case of spouses killing each other, we can talk about America being an exception about who dies, but typically around the world, it's wives who are killed by their husbands. This is the most typical pattern. I mean, you do get the reverse, but you get usually, in Canada, it's about 3 or 4 wives are dead for every husband that's killed, and
much higher in other places.
And in Britain, it's similar, but yeah, in lots of other countries, you never get a wife killing a husband in some societies, and so there is that pattern. So what we're talking about is husbands killing wives typically, and what is the motivational context that seems to be common to all these places are the issues of what we would call male sexual proprietariness, male sexual jealousy. The male is upset and angry about his belief of her infidelity. She may not have been sexually unfaithful, but he thinks so, and her desire to leave him. So what men do is they hunt down sometimes a woman who has left. And sometimes they're trying to engage in some kind of persuasion, some coercive persuasion, to get her to come back. And in that context, sometimes it's, if you like, gets out of hand, or an accident happens, or maybe he's more negligent in his threats with her, and reckless, such that there's a homicide resulting. Sometimes the same kind of situation where he goes after her to persuade her back is not to get her back so much, but sometimes it's a revenge. if I can't have her, nobody can, and the mental state seems to be of revenge.
It really all stems from this sense of ownership.
Yes, she's mine.
In these relationships and contracts, marriages, whatever that you find throughout all these cultures, one common thread is that the woman is as much property as a partner.
Right, right. And in some societal contexts, she is perhaps more a property than a partner.
And one of the fascinating aspects of is you look at why. Why is that the case? And there seems to be, it all goes back to this whole sort of biological imperative about the male in these relationships making sure that whatever offspring are involved are truly his children.
I mean, as a man, do you want to respond to that?
We'll let Martin
Sort of,
take
yeah.
this.
No, I mean, the evolutionary argument for a sexual asymmetry, for a sex difference in sort of mindset about the marital relationship has to do exactly with that. In animals in which fertilization takes place inside the female, like mammals, including us, paternity is uncertain. Is the jargon. A woman can know who her child is from birth and can invest preferentially in it, love it,
It's
risk her
always
life
hers.
for it.
It's always her
hers.
child.
It's
Yeah.
always hers. Paternity being uncertain creates the circumstance where males can be cuckolded, can invest their efforts in rearing other men's children, and a lot of male animals in which males make any sort of serious material investment in fathering. They're vulnerable to quotes wasting their efforts. I mean, natural selection will favor tending to channel your efforts preferentially to your own kids, and whatever that takes. It might take mate guarding in a lot of cases, in a lot of monogamous birds where males feed the kids, for example. Males guard their mates during the fertile period, and they use their success in guarding, the consistency with which they maintain surveillance over their partner as a cue that regulates how much food they put into the kids 2 weeks later when the eggs hatch, for example. And we argue that it's an analogous sort of argument with people. It's quite rare in mammals for males to be big parental investors, big caretakers. I mean, the much more common mammalian situation is females take care of the kids, and males basically try and sire some and then take a hike. But you find various species, including people, in which pairs form, the kids are reared cooperatively and together with some input from both. And that's the kind of circumstance which arguably creates strong selection on male psychology to do whatever it takes to guarantee paternity. You might expect male competition over access to females even regardless of this as well. I mean, the idea that a sort of widespread idea in evolutionary biology is that in animals like mammals, females are not really limited in their reproductive capacity by access to males. Males show up; they're the least of your problems. Food, not getting killed by some predator.
Including males.
Including
Yeah.
males. Not a non-trivial point. Yeah. I mean, these are a female's problems in many cases. Whereas to some extent, male fitness is just limited by access to females. The more females he can copulate with, the more females he can monopolize, the more kids he's going to have. It doesn't help a female to have 27 husbands. She's not going to out-reproduce somebody else with one good one. So in that sense, there's a lot of male-male competition over access to females. There's a lot of male concern with whether a female is mated with some other guy, whereas arguably females have less reason to care much if a male they're interested in might have mated with some other female. Not no reason, because that's a cue of what else he's going to do, where he's going to spend his time and money, but there's an asymmetry in their reasons for caring about these kinds of issues like fidelity. And it seems like there's an asymmetry in their preoccupations with them, in the strength of their emotional reactions to them.
One of the most fascinating pieces of work from my reading of it had to do with some work you did about what mothers who have just given birth to children most often say to their partners who are in the room. Can you talk a bit about that work?
Well, because of this problem, that men have about uncertain paternity. We anticipated that males should be very interested at the time of the birth in what the child looked like, because this is the first time that he has, evidence, if you like, whether that child is his or not. And so we had the idea that at the birth time, it might be the case that women sort of push the idea to the man that this child looks like him.
He looks just like you.
Right. And we had no idea whether that was the case. And we managed to find an archive of videotapes of birth were taken for totally different reasons in Colorado, in Denver. And there was over 100 tapes of the first from 15 minutes to an hour after the birth, or as the birthing was occurring and time afterwards. And so I watched these tapes and recorded everything that was said at the time. Martin watched them for a while, but he found them a bit distasteful. I think it was too painful to watch.
The subject of another study entirely.
Really. And anyway, so then we analyzed the data, and we saw that indeed that the comments that women made, they would say things like, "Oh, she looks just like you," or something like this. And if it didn't matter if the husbands were there or not, that there was just, the women were as likely to say, "Oh, he looks just like my husband," even if he wasn't there. And the men, if they were there, they said things. They were a bit more skeptical. "Well, I don't know, it looks maybe like you," or something like that. Some men were quite humorous about it. Even the medical staff are sometimes in tune to this kind of discussion, so it must happen a lot. I remember one woman saying something about, "Well, what does the baby look like?" And the doctor was teasing her, and the husband pipes up and says, "I don't care as long as she's bald," and here he's sitting there very, very bald. And
have you done this in any other place? I mean, have you repeated this?
Well, what we did do back home is I didn't think that we would like to sit up all night, waiting for births to happen in hospitals. So we ran a little questionnaire study where we took the announcements from the newspapers in our city, and it turns out, since it's a free service in the paper, that about 85–90% of all births are reported in the paper. And so we sent a cute card to the people who had just had a baby, and there was 4 parts of the card. One was for mom to answer, one was for dad, and one was a mother's relative, and one was a father's relative. And we asked them a few questions about, who named the baby, and birth order, and who did they think the baby resembled. And we got the same asymmetry. Mother and mother's relatives more often said the baby looked like the father or the father's relatives than the father's or the father's relatives said.
In fact, all parties, the fathers and fathers' relatives as well, all showed a bias towards alleging paternal resemblance rather than maternal resemblance. I mean, everybody seemed more in tune to it. So you say, who does the baby most closely resemble? Everybody names a relative. Nobody says Winston Churchill. Nobody says the milkman.
Postman.
No, they don't. No. Everybody says relative, but also that there's disproportionate emphasis on paternal side relatives, and then especially from mother.
Especially from mother.
And then you ask if we haven't replicated it in a completely different culture, but somebody else did. A couple of anthropologists we know, Gene Rogalski and Steve Gollin, did it in a little Mayan-speaking community down in the Yucatan, where they went around to all these houses where there was a new birth, and they interviewed the mother, the father, the mother's mother, the father's mother, and among the questions they asked them, who's the baby most similar to? And they got the same thing. Everybody tends to think the babies look more like dads than like moms, but especially the mom. And they actually had the effect that the mother's mother was more likely to say this than the father's mother, which was one of our expectations, but we only had it very slightly in that direction. They had it more clearly.
And also, it didn't make a difference whether it was a son or a daughter that they were talking about. There was no sex difference in the infant in this allegation of paternal resemblance. There was in both studies, our studies and theirs, a birth order effect. It was much stronger for the first child than for a subsequent children. And And the idea might be that this is a sort of an insecure time in the bonding of the marital relationship, that once you've got through this and you've sort of committed to raising this other children and you've got the confidence of each other, maybe this is not such an important motivational...
not so much anxiety about it. I mean, this is to discuss this whole project, is a lot of fun because it's something that's so familiar to everyone.
Right.
Again, there is, however, another piece of work that you did, which again has to do with the universality of stories about whether or not a child is really a biological child in a family. And I think the lecture you do is called "The Truth About Cinderella." And this is a much more, it's a very somber and sobering side of this whole issue. Talk a bit about stepchildren and what you found, how you found out about this.
You can go.
Yeah, one of the issues that arose in thinking about interpersonal conflict and trying to think about human social behavior in an evolutionary perspective quite a long time ago, 20 years ago now, I guess, in a seminar we were talking about how some non-human animal research was concerned with the issue of parental discrimination between offspring who are definitely one's own and offspring who either might not be or who were known to be one's predecessors. So you have the case in various kinds of animals in which there's a pair with still dependent young and one partner disappears for whatever reason, whether by accident or whether displaced by somebody else of the same sex. So a male takes over a female and her kids from another male, for example, say in lions or in some monkeys or in some birds. And in a lot of these cases, not all of them, and that's interesting too, but in a lot of these cases, the new partner will either actively dispose of his predecessor's kids or at least ignore them and not invest in them like a real parent. And this is actually true with replacement females as well as replacement males in some bird cases. And so in the context of thinking about these things and about why they occur, where they occur, a student in this seminar 20 years ago said, well, what's the lowdown on quotes, cruel step-parents? I mean, everybody knows myths, the so-called myth of the cruel step-parent. Everybody knows about Cinderella stories. What's the reality behind them? And if you're a student in a seminar saying, hey, what's the reality about this general phenomenon is a mistake, because it's a good way to get yourself some extra work. The reply is immediately, well, why don't you go look up the literature on this and come back and tell us about it at next week's meeting? And so the student did that, and she came back and she said, there's nothing. I can't find a thing. There's a huge literature on child abuse. No one seems to have investigated whether stepchildren are at excess risk, for example. So we got interested in it. We started trying to do the research. We realized one reason why no one had done it was there was no good population at large data on how many kids are stepchildren. If you think back to the last time you filled out a census form, you'll realize that the census doesn't collect the information that would enable you to say how many one-year-olds live with two genetic parents versus mother and stepfather versus father and stepmother, and so on. They don't make those distinctions. So it's hard to get the population at large data, but without boring with details, you can come up with estimates and information, and we find that stepkids are much more likely than children of the two parties. Same-age children with socioeconomic factors apparently well controlled, and some other things that you might think were sort of messing up the analyses apparently well controlled. You get huge differences in the rate at which children are abused and show up in child abuse samples.
And killed.
And killed. At first we were worried that the child abuse sample differences were really largely a reflection of reporting biases, that people phone the welfare agency more on stepfathers than they do on genetic fathers, for example. But the homicide data seem to eliminate that possibility, and the differences are even bigger. I mean, you get anywhere from sort of 40 to 100-fold higher rates. I mean, you're not talking about tiny effects, we're not talking about 10% effects, we're talking about several 1,000% effects in differential likelihood of being killed. Still rare. I mean, when you say a stepkid, say a 1-year-old stepkid is 70 times as likely to be killed as one living with two genetic parents in Canada, for example. I mean, you're still talking 1 in thousands.
But you're talking about the
kids.
patterns
Yeah.
of this type of thing.
Yeah.
Is the risk the same from the female parent as it is from the male parent?
Well, that's really hard to test. And the reason it's hard to test is that it's the very young children, it's the preschool children that are at greatest risk.
And that as they get older, the risk decreases.
The risk decreases, and that can be for various reasons. One reason is the children can take protective measures themselves, they can run away and things like that. And young children are vulnerable. But if you look at the preschool children, you think about how many would have a stepmother. You have to have had a mother, the relationship had to break up, the father had to get custody and get a new wife. And so there's very, very few cases of stepmothers killing small children. We have a few in all our homicide samples, but it's hard to get a reliable estimate because the denominator for the population at large is so small that then our estimates are we don't know.
When you get up to like 8 or 10-year-old kids, there's maybe 2 or 3 living with a stepfather for everyone living with a stepmother. But with really small kids, there's hundreds living with a stepfather for everyone living with a stepmother.
And you're talking about basic sample size.
Yes.
We are almost out of time. The half hour has just absolutely flown by. What are the implications of what you are discovering in terms of what do you do with this information? How does it affect all of us?
Well, I think there are some real implications in terms of prevention, of identifying cases at risk. Maybe not in a particular case, but you may be able to set up some kinds of vigilances on certain kinds of social contexts and certain family circumstances that may be able to be useful in sort of intervening so that something like this doesn't happen. And I say that because the work is analogous to general epidemiology that you do for any kind of health hazard. So if you are aware of some of the circumstantial and demographic risk factors, that you can inform people, you can educate people, you can be more alert if you're a social worker with these kinds of cases, or even medical people with these kinds of cases coming to the clinics. And it just might make a difference on the incidence of these kinds of killings. I think it's exactly analogous to general epidemiological work.
Well, it's fascinating work. I wish we had more time, but we don't. We're out of time, and I want to thank you both so much, Martin Daly and Margo Wilson, for visiting on Upon Reflection and for visiting the University of Washington.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.